students from 20 different universities on the West Coast, really passionate about earthquake engineering research as it applies to academia and the profession. Basically, we are trying to cultivate a community where we can have conversations about both the research that's being done and not just thinking about, I guess, what is happening locally within each of our campuses, but also, I think, on the West Coast as a whole. We have partnerships with many of the earthquake engineering companies here on the West Coast as well. So it's really all about bringing everyone together to not only do better research, but also to disseminate and deploy that research at scale. With that being said, I invite everyone to join this community, and we will be providing a form at the end of the talk today to essentially give you the opportunities to sign up. And we do have a LinkedIn page for you to join as well. With that being said, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our first speaker of 2023, Dr. Henry V. Burton, who will be discussing the applications of machine learning algorithms to draw accurate causal conclusions from observational data. Dr. Burton is an associate professor and the presidential chair in structural engineering in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at UCLA, where I also studied. So it's great to have you, Professor. His research is directed towards understanding and modeling the relationship between the performance of infrastructure systems within the built environment and the ability of communities to minimize the extent of socioeconomic disruption following extreme events. Professor Burton is a registered structural engineer in the state of California, and before he obtained his PhD in civil engineering at Stanford, he spent 6 years in practice at Degenkolb Engineers, where he worked on numerous projects involving the design of new buildings and seismic evaluation and retrofit of existing buildings. He is a recipient in the National Science Foundation Next Generation of Disaster Researchers Fellowship and the National Science Foundation Career Award in 2016. In conclusion, it is my great privilege to introduce the esteemed Professor Henry Burton, a renowned expert in his field. His vast knowledge and experience will be an asset to all of us. Please join us in welcoming him today.
All right. Thanks, Omar. That was that was quite the introduction. So it says the host disabled participant screen share.
Okay, I got you. Okay, you should be able to share now.
Okay. All right. So welcome everyone. So I want to sort of frame the presentation that I'm going to give a little bit. It's a little bit different from the great precedent that Omar set. I saw on LinkedIn, you know, it said if you want to learn about applying machine learning in earthquake engineering, come to this presentation. And so I guess one thing I would say is that I gave a presentation as part of a Sim Center workshop. Share the YouTube link, Omar, and he can share it with others so you can see it. I think that one got more into sort of the nuts and bolts of machine learning as it relates to not just earthquake engineering, but just natural hazards in general. Today, I sort of want to take a step back because I know, so presumably these are mostly students, maybe graduate students, either involved in research or getting ready to be involved in research. So I want to take a step back and sort of think about the relationship of the earthquake engineering community to data and in a modeling context. And I am going to talk about, as it says here, statistical and machine learning. But I'm also going to use that as an opportunity to highlight sort of the limitations of that particular type of modeling and talk a little bit about causal inference, which I personally see as sort of the next frontier in data-driven modeling, not just in earthquake engineering, but more broadly. So I have an overview here. I will talk about, I'll start by talking about, again, our relationship as a community to data. So what types of data we collect and how do we use it? I'll talk a little bit about machine learning in earthquake engineering. I'm going to keep this at a fairly high level, so speaking mostly about sort of opportunities and challenges. And then I'll get into this notion of causal inference and sort of present what I see as sort of, you know, again, the next step in the evolution of how we use observational data. And then I'll conclude with some final thoughts. So every time somebody joins the thing, I see an admit thing popping up on my screen. Let me see if I hide the panel, maybe that might help. Let me see, hide floating meeting controls. Okay, so maybe that might help. Okay, so yeah, so I'll start with talking a little bit about our relationship to data. So before I do that, so as earthquake engineers, I would say that we have 3 primary tools for advancing research and practice. So one of them is controlled experiments. So you'll see that I sort of highlighted the term control there. And the reason is that, you know, we do use experimental data in a different context where we just take a bunch of different experiments that were done for different reasons and we try to infer things from it. So that I would consider sort of observational data, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But a control experiment is a situation where you have a specific question and you do a specific experiment or set of experiments to answer that question, right? So that's what I mean by control experiment. Obviously, we also use engineering models, different types of engineering models. And then we use what I call observational data. The term observational here just means data generated by either sort of a natural phenomena or an experiment or set of experiments that were not intended specifically for the use that it is being used for. So to give you an example, we collect a lot of data, for example, on, say, beam column experiments, and there are folks who like collect that data and develop statistical models to do things with it. Well, when those experiments were carried out, they weren't carried out with, you know, these data-driven models in mind exactly, right? They were carried out to investigate specific things. So if you take a bunch of data from those experiments and you sort of put them together, I would characterize those as observational data. And obviously these things don't happen in a vacuum. They're sort of related, right? So you use experiments to calibrate models, you use observational data to inform experiments. So they don't happen sort of in a vacuum, but usually depending on the investigation, usually there's one sort of driver of whatever it is you're looking at. So today we're really just going to primarily focus on our use of observational data. So what are the ways, so where do we get this data from and how do we use it? So I used the example of physical experiments earlier to distinguish between a control experiment and a set of experimental data that I put in the category of observational data, right? So, so for different types of structural components or systems or subsystems, over the years, we've done quite a bit of experiments as a community, and there's been various efforts by different researchers to pool that data and use statistics and more recently machine learning to try to infer things from that data, or mostly I would say to develop predictive models, right? So that's one way that we use data and sort of how we and where we get the data from. Another source of data is from field reconnaissance, right? So this is obviously very important. And, you know, more recently, we have several organizations that are dedicated towards, you know, doing reconnaissance in a systematic way to sort of maximize the amount of information that we get from the data that we collect, right? So when we collect that field reconnaissance data, we use it for various reasons. For example, if we have damage data, we might use it to develop fragility functions. We might perform statistical analysis to look at correlations between, you know, different properties of our infrastructure or the hazard and the things that we observe. there's the development of predictive models using machine learning. That's a thing that that is of interest to a lot of people these days. And then a lot of times we were able to draw sort of anecdotal insights from this field reconnaissance. And I say anecdotal, meaning there's not enough observations to allow us to do sort of a systematic type of assessment of, say, what is the effect of property A on the damage. But maybe we've seen one or two situations where we think this serves as some evidence, but you know, it's limited in terms of the way the strength of the evidence that it provides. We also use data within our simulation. So simulations are interesting, right? Because obviously when you're doing a simulation, it's more in the category of an engineering model. But when we do simulations using ground motions, right, where we're interested in, say, the effect of some particular type of ground motion property, duration, pulses, basin effect, spectral shape. If we're interested in the effect of these different properties on ground motions, more often than not, we're using empirical ground motions, right? Recorded ground motions, motions from real events. And I would put those records in the observational data category because, you know, we don't really have control over the ground motions that happen, right? The ground motions that are controlled by the earthquakes, and the earthquakes are controlled by nature, so to speak, right? So I would put the ground motions in the category of observational data, but we use them in the context of numerical simulations. Another way we use data is from response measurements, right? So we have sensors that we can place in buildings to record the responses, and we can use these responses in different ways. We can use it for response reconstruction. That just means maybe you have, for a given structure, you measure part of the response and you're trying to recreate the response in another part of the structure. There's been a long history of using measured responses to do system identification, updating structural models, doing damage assessment, that type of stuff. So, you know, given that we have all these ways of collecting and using data, more recently, there's been a lot of different efforts towards trying to sort of curate and store that data in a way that makes it accessible to people that want to use the data. So this is an example of a database that we put together, a relational database on. It's meant to support post-earthquake damage, building damage, and recovery. And so one of the things you'll see is that the journal papers are they're creating a new category of paper called data papers, where, you know, the group that puts together the data and organizes it and writes it up clearly would get, you know, you would get credit for your data every time someone uses it. Right. So this is another type of data set. This is another type of data set that we developed. This one is actually based on strong motion recordings. They're both relational databases, so they're very well organized and easy to retrieve the data and stuff like that. As we sort of look to the future, I would encourage us to think sort of instead of thinking in terms of different types of data and having them in different databases, I would encourage us to think in terms of knowledge systems, right? So imagine you have this system where you can ask a question, and the answer to the question is given based on data, but it's based on prior knowledge. It's also based on maybe some engineering models that you have, and all of these things working together, right? So this is an example of a knowledge system that was developed by Moriba Jah. He's actually an aerospace engineer from University of Texas. And this particular knowledge system is for tracking space debris, if you will. And so it's done using what's called a graph database. But the interesting thing is that it doesn't just contain data. It actually has data, models, and other sort of general information that are all talking to each other. And so if you have a question, you can actually query this particular knowledge system, and it would depending on the level of intelligence, it would actually be able to query the models, the data, the prior knowledge that's in there to be able to answer these questions. And obviously, NSF has invested in, and through NERI, NSF has invested in the importance of being able to collect and curate data, in terms of the natural hazards community. So for example, there's Design Safe, which serves as a hub. There's the Rapid Center, which serves as a facility to facilitate the collection of data after events. Okay, so moving on, I'm going to talk a little bit about machine learning within the context of earthquake engineering and some of the opportunities that we have, as well as some of the challenges. So I thought I'd start with this snapshot. So this is a slide that I went through, that I put together for the presentation that I mentioned before, that was for the Sim Center, and it was focused more broadly on natural hazards engineering, and it just kind of shows a timeline of sort of the work that's been done within not just, well, I would say structural engineering, but also natural hazards engineering as it relates to machine learning applications. And one of the things you'll see is that towards the end of the timeline, there's been multiple state-of-the-art review papers that have been written, right? And I would say that a lot of that has happened within the last 5 to 10 years or so. So that tells you there's been a lot of work done in this area. And I think it's important, if you want to get into this, if you're sort of interested in the intersection of machine learning and earthquake engineering, you want to take a step back and really get a sense for what's been done, sort of, and think about where we're heading as a community and what the real opportunities are to contribute here. And I'll try to give some insight into that as well during this presentation. Here, I'm not going to go through them individually, but these are just a list of the state-of-the-art review papers that have been written so far. There are six of them. So these are papers that are within the fields of structural engineering and natural hazards engineering, and just risk assessment in general, right? So I'll share these slides with Omar, so you'll be able to have these papers as a reference. So a question that often comes up is, when does it make sense to even consider machine learning for the problem that you're tackling? And so I think one sort of obvious area is if you were to use an empirical model anyway, right? Meaning that prior to this sort of our recent fascination with, if you will, with machine learning within the last few years, we've always used empirical data, and we've used them to develop statistical models and so forth, right? So what we've seen is that in general, you can probably increase the accuracy of your predictive model. Now, there's not a free lunch, and there's some issues with that, and we'll talk about it. There's some, but in general, you can probably get a more accurate predictive model from machine learning. So if you're considering a statistical model and predictive accuracy is something that is of interest to you, then it's a good idea to consider machine learning. This second one, I would say, is unique in that anything that involves extracting information from images or text, you really can't get very far without machine learning, right? So whereas the first one, I think you can still do a lot with sort of traditional statistical models. This second one, when you're talking about extracting large amounts of information from images and text, or retrieval from information from harsh conditions, for example, using robots, again, you can't really get very far without machine learning, right? So that's sort of an obvious application area. When you have systems that involve sort of sequencing different activities, such as in the context of post-earthquake recovery, right, where you have to have like inspections, you have to have damage assessments, repairs done. There are different things that need to happen before you can even start repairing, right? So you have a sequence of activities, and maybe there's a situation where you want to optimize the sequence of those activities. Then specifically reinforced learning is a good sort of technique for that. Another one is anywhere you have complex or computationally expensive multi-step workflow that has some stochasticity built into it. I'll give some specific examples later, but we've seen that surrogate models can be useful for reducing the computational expense and complexity of some of these large-scale stochastic simulations. This last one says if it allows you to acquire new knowledge about the problem at hand. And I would argue that this is the one that we've been leveraging the least so far. And I would also argue that sort of the next frontier, which causal inference, which I describe as the next frontier in sort of the way we work with data, will put us in a better position to really extract knowledge from data. Right. So, learning from data is one thing, but sort of extracting fundamental knowledge and understanding is sort of a higher bar, if you will. Okay, so getting on to some sample applications. So this is the context here is, I mentioned before, using surrogate models to reduce the computational expense associated with different types of simulation. So the context here is maybe you're doing some type of regional seismic performance assessment. You want to use explicit simulations, meaning you want to do, say, nonlinear response history analyses, and maybe you even want to run that through a loss model. Depending on the scale of the problem, it may be useful to do some of that with surrogate models. So in this study, we looked at different types of models for doing that. And we sort of described it as a spectrum of possibilities, where on the left end, it's purely mechanics-based models, and on the right end, it's purely data-driven. And then there's sort of a hybrid of those two things. And so one of the things that we did in this study is we said, the plot shown here, the horizontal axis, is sort of how much domain knowledge is needed by the user, and or you can also think about it also as the amount of effort that's needed on the part of the user, and the vertical axis is the predictive accuracy, right? So ideally, you want things to be in the upper left-hand corner, right? Because if the goal is to reduce sort of computational expense and all of that, you want to sort of reduce the effort on the part of the user, but you want to sort of get the best predictive performance out of it. So we basically sort of situated different types of models, meaning sort of mechanics-based, data-driven, and hybrid. And I should mention the mechanics-based models we're talking about here are simplified models, right? So they're models, for example, you might be trying to use an equivalent single degree of freedom system to estimate the response of an MDOF, right? Those types of models. So while they're mechanics-based, they are highly simplified. So that's why you see in some cases that the mechanics-based models don't quite perform as well. So thinking more broadly about, okay, we want to do machine learning for efficiency using surrogate models. We sort of want to take a step back and think about the bigger picture and sort of where that fits into the general problems that we're trying to solve, right? So in general, when we have a real building and we develop a structural model to estimate the response of that building, there's a lot of uncertainty, or let's say there's a lot of differences in the relationship between the results we get out of the model and the response of the actual building, right? So there's some separation there. And we do different things to close that separation gap. So for example, we do system level testing, right? So if our model is informed by system level testing, then it's going to be better, right? And oftentimes we might do component level testing, which is not as good, but it still gets us good information, right? So one way to sort of think about this is that at each of these steps, there's some error or some uncertainty that's introduced, right? So if you build a model a structural model just based on component level testing, there's a certain level of error, whereas if you build it based on system level testing, there's a certain level of uncertainty, right? So if you think about the surrogate model, one of the things we're doing is we're introducing an additional sort of uncertainty layer into the model, right? Because remember, the surrogate model is being trained off of our simulation model. We don't have enough system level test data or even response measurements from real earthquakes to develop the surrogate model. So oftentimes we're using structural simulations to do that, right? And so we're putting more distance between the model that we're going to use for making decisions and the real building, right? So that's something to think about. So one interesting question is, how big is that beta relative to all of the others, right? Is it a lot larger than, say, beta 2, beta 3, and so forth? Or in general, is the uncertainty in our surrogate model much larger than the uncertainty that's associated with, say, what's called the choice of the finite element model that we choose and so forth, right? Or even the model parameter uncertainty, right? So it would be nice to sort of get a sense for when we quantify sort of the errors out of our in our surrogate model, where does that fit in terms of all of the other errors or uncertainty that we typically work with. And then also thinking about this idea of doing machine learning for increased efficiency, we can also ask the question about, well, what about automation, right? So this is a slide that sort of summarizes a tool that we developed, AutoSDA. It basically designs steel moment frames and also builds the OpenSeas models and runs them, right? And this is not the only effort like that. So I would say within the community, I think a lot of people are leveraging automation in different types of ways, right? And so automation is also useful for efficiency. So, and if we're using automation, we actually don't, if we're just using automation, we don't introduce that additional layer of error, right? So it may be the case that, even with the automation, we still have a certain level of computational burden and the surrogate model is still needed, but it's not always clear that that's the case, right? So I think something that we need to start thinking about is how do we balance the use of automation in terms of mechanistic simulations? And by mechanistic, I just mean we're explicitly simulating whatever the phenomena is that is of interest to us versus using surrogate models. I think there's a balance that needs to be struck there. And at this point, it's not really clear to me what that balance is, and I haven't really seen anyone investigate that in any level of detail. Okay, so moving on to sort of a different sort of type of use of machine learning models. So as I mentioned before, we have a long history of collecting data and developing fairly, traditional, using them to develop predictive models using traditional statistical methods. And so a natural question is, well, if you use machine learning, what does that get you, right? So in this particular study, we were looking at the drift capacity of reinforced concrete walls with special boundary elements. There was a model, a linear model that was developed by Abdallah and Wallace that's currently used in ACI 318. And then we said, okay, well, can that model be improved, at least in terms of accuracy, using machine learning? And so that's what we did here. And we end up finding that the answer is yes, it is improved, at least in terms of accuracy. Now, I mentioned at the start of this presentation that improvement in accuracy, it's not a free lunch, right? So it does come with some trade-offs. And one of those trade-offs, I hesitate to say it, but let me say it and then I'll let you know why I'm hesitating. So one of those trade-offs is the idea that machine learning models are not sort of they don't naturally provide sort of explanations for the results that they give, right? So that's you hear that a lot, right? So I'm sure you've been seeing a lot of papers on unexplainable machine learning models, right? And the whole idea is, can you do some things with your model or the results that you get out of it so that it can let the user make sense of how is the model interpreting the relationship between the input variables and the output variables, right? So that's sort of a general argument. My view on it is that we are entering an era, a time where, historically, as engineers, we like empirical equations, we like analytical equations because we can immediately look at it and we can sort of tell, how a particular variable is related to our outcome. So for example, you can look at this and you can see that, a higher shear stress means a lower drift capacity, right? So it's sort of intuitive, you can look at it. But I would argue that you can develop the same type of intuition using sort of visual sort of representations of that input-output relationship. And I would also argue that you can do much more with the visual representations of that input-output relationship than you can do with a analytical model. So for example, interactions between two inputs, the effect of interactions between two inputs, it's not always obvious by just looking at the analytical equation, whereas that's easy to visualize. So I think my view is that we're sort of entering an era where we'll have a lot more of these sort of visual representations of inputs and outputs. And I think if we work with them consistently over time, it would allow us to build a type of intuition that we now have with analytical equations. And I think that intuition would even go further, right? That's sort of that's a bit of an opinion. My opinion. I'm happy to hear differing opinions. That's why we're here. But that's where I see that. Now, I mentioned before that one of the reasons you would use machine learning, say, over traditional statistics is that you're more than likely to get an improvement in accuracy, but it's not without some cost, right? Because you're generally dealing with a black box model. But as we said before, there are things you can do to sort of make the model a little bit more transparent. But so I think there's the question of what is the value of that increased accuracy? Like is there a tangible benefit in that accuracy when it comes to, say, design or performance assessment or something like that, right? So this is a slide that shows the results from a famous sort of image recognition competition that's been held over the years, and you sort of see over the years that the classification errors has decreased, as you would expect. And between 2011 2012, that's sort of where we started leveraging deep learning, and the term deep learning revolution is sort of associated with that period. And if you look at the sort of broader applications of machine learning in the broader sort of society, a lot of it is, there's a direct, for example, in advertising, there's a direct link between accuracy and, say, advertising revenue, right? So I think we need to ask the same question. So this is a slide showing sort of different types of models, machine learning, traditional, for predicting shear strength. And, so you can look at the differences in accuracy and you can ask, well, what does that mean in terms of performance or design? I think that's a question that we need to start asking. And so that's a question that we've been probing a little bit. So if we look at this model, right, so this is a comparison of our drift capacity model. On the left, it's the linear model. On the right, it's the machine learning model. And you would see the machine learning model reduces the coefficient of variation by about a factor of 2. And so we've been developing or using some reliability-based techniques to try to quantify, well, what difference does that make in terms of design or in terms of performance? And so you can see here, at least in terms of the probability of failure, failure here is the exceedance of the drift capacity. It really isn't mattering that much, right? And we're seeing a similar thing in terms of design. So one of the things we need to think about is, what is the delta in the accuracy improvement that we're getting? And also, what is the baseline accuracy? What was the accuracy of the quote unquote traditional model in the first place? Right. So these are things that these are questions that we need to sort of ask. This is another application that involves regional damage assessment. So you have some data collected on building damage after an earthquake. You train a model. In this case, it was a classification model to predict. In this case, it was the tags, right? And so some of the questions that come out of that are, how does that model perform relative to hazards, right? I haven't seen anything like that out there. Can we make the machine learning model as interpretable or more interpretable than hazards? What if I train, in the study I showed you, we trained a model on the Napa earthquake, and we did our due diligence, we did our training testing split, but the training testing split was still in the context of a single earthquake, right? So what if we took the model developed from the Napa earthquake and we applied it to Northridge, right? So that obviously has implications to the generalizability of these machine learning models. And related to generalizability, how many events do you need to consider in your training data to make the machine learning model generalizable? Now, as you think about that question, you need to keep in mind, you need to be comparing apples to apples, right? So you have to also ask the same question about the traditional model. You have to ask the same question about hazards, right? Because hazards, while it does have some engineering sort of things built in there, it is largely a data-driven model, right? So you kind of have to, if you're going to ask that question of machine learning, you're going to have to ask the same question of hazards, assuming that you're trying to figure out which one is more useful. And another question is, does a practitioner have to be knowledgeable about machine learning to apply the model? To me, that's not the answer to that is not obvious. And so, that's something we can think about. Okay, so I'll start to I think we're good on time, but I'll start to speed up a little bit. So here I'm going to talk about active learning. So I mentioned one of the applications of machine learning model is if you have sort of a computationally expensive sort of simulation process. In this case, we're looking at a water distribution system, and we're simulating the hazard, the physical damage. We're doing hydraulic simulation through the winter tool, and then we're also simulating recovery of the hydraulic performance. So that's a multi-step process, and different parts of it are highly computationally expensive, especially the winter part, right? And we can do this end-to-end simulation for a single event, but we can also do it for a full spectrum of events, right? So a risk-based assessment where we consider all the possible events that can affect the region, and we combine the results probabilistically, right? So that starts to get computationally expensive when you start looking at multiple events. So considering for us, and in this case, we were looking at the Napa water system, each simulation can take anywhere between 2 and 6 hours, depending on the level of damage. We did use parallel computing, but in our case, we used the USURF2, which had 2,300 or so events. If we used USURF3, the number of events would increase by a factor of 100. What if we looked at a larger system? So Napa has about 612 kilometers of pipe. In Los Angeles County, you're talking about a factor of 20. Right, in terms of the amount of pipe. So obviously a much larger model. And then the type of metric you use can also affect the model complexity. So we use active learning. And so the idea behind active learning is that you can incrementally select a subset of the events and run the end-to-end simulation. And the answer you get would be similar or close to the answer that you would have gotten with the entire event set anyway, right? So that's the basic idea behind active learning. These are the steps. It involves building a surrogate model using Gauss's process regression. And one of the things you have to do, because I mentioned it's an incremental process, right? So you're selecting events incrementally and you're running through the simulation. And so you have to decide when to stop selecting. And so for that, you use something called an uncertainty stopping criterion. I'm not going to go into the details of it. So we used active learning on this particular thing. It worked well. We gave ourselves a pat on the back. We wrote a paper. And so, in retrospect, there's some questions you can ask. You can say, well, it is definitely a powerful tool because it allows you to learn from incrementally generating mechanistic simulations, right? So when we wrote this paper, we argued that this approach was better than the previous approach, which involved sort of an optimization framework where the full mechanistic assessment of the complete set was used. So then we said, okay, well, that kind of defeats the purpose. So, our approach where you're using incremental events is better. Now, And we said, well, we don't need to do the complete event set simulation for the active learning. But we did actually use the complete set because, you know, if we're gonna say it works well, we actually showed that by comparing it to the results from the full set. So I don't know, maybe you can say that that was a little bit of trickery, but what I would say is that I think there is a way to leverage these incremental sort of simulations and developing surrogate models that way. But for it to be actually useful, meaning going beyond being able to write a paper and sort of give yourself a pat on the back, I think you really need to think about this stopping criteria. And I think it would take quite a bit of work to be able to say, okay, we're confident enough that with this stopping criteria, we don't necessarily need to run the entire event set simulation. So we've done this enough time for enough different types of systems where we're confident that this stopping criteria is okay. We haven't done that yet. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears. So that was the machine learning portion of the presentation. So now I'm going to talk about causal inference and observational data. I'm calling it a new paradigm on earthquake engineering. Feel free to challenge me on the new paradigm part of that. That's what we're here for. We're here to share ideas and challenge each other and things like that. Okay, so before I get into it, so this is based on a paper that I recently published in Earthquake Spectra. So if you're interested in any of the details of this, you know, there's much more details in the paper. So I guess to start, this term causal inference, you may have heard it before in passing, and you may not be clear when you say causal inference. When you hear causal inference in the context of sort of you know, rigorous, you know, data-driven assessment, what does that mean? Well, one place to start is, well, we know that correlation is not causation, right? So we learned that in sort of the first statistics class. Any first class in statistics that we take, that's typically something that's drilled into us, right? When we do these regressions, it's an associative relationship. It's not a causal relationship, right? So that's, you know, so I think we're all on the same we're all on the same page here. But this is a more formal definition by two scholars that are sort of experts in this field. And I say by in this field because there's this broad field of causal inference that has been advancing over the past. I mean, it's really over the past, you can argue it's been over the past century, but I would say it's within the last decade or two that there's been significant advancements. And it's primarily been in the areas of like computer science, statistics, and the social sciences. Right. So in this definition by Jennifer Hill and Elizabeth Stewart, the key thing here is it says it allows researchers to draw conclusions based on data. Right. So if we sort of think back to some of the things I showed earlier, I said, you know, we collect data, we do statistics on that data, or we do machine learning on that data. And we also said that, you know, these are associative relationships. They're not causal relationships. Right. So that already sort of tells us that we're sort of not quite there. But also, I don't think anybody would argue with me when I say, you know, when we sort of do these simulations or these modelings, we're using it to sort of inform some type of intervention, right? We want to do something to make a system better. We want to understand the system better so that we can help it perform better, right? And I don't think anybody would argue that those interventions should be ideally informed by causal relationships, not necessarily by association relationships, right? The associational relationship sort of moves us in the right direction, but it doesn't quite get us to causal relationship. So this is a picture that I showed before, and I said there are sort of three tools that we have for getting advancing earthquake engineering. Well, here I'm reframing the title a little bit. I'm saying there's three sources of causal insights, right? So if we go back to the physical experiment, right? If you want to say what's the effect of the yield strength of steel on the performance of this steel plate shear wall, you would design two sets of specimens, and the only difference between the two, for the most part, would be the yield strength of steel. You test the two of them, you get a causal relationship on the effective yield strength on the response. Same thing with this with the simulation model, right? You can make controlled changes to different variables where you can sort of get that intervention. You're sort of simulating that intervention within your experiment or within the engineering model. But if there's a data set that was sort of given to you, say by an earthquake or by someone who collected data from a bunch of different experiments that weren't really used for the same purpose, those data are within this category of observational data, such that, you know, if you want to get causal information from that data, then just regular statistics is not going to cut it. And and also machine learning by itself, in the way that we've been applying it, is not going to cut it. And so, to sort of help drive this point home, I'll use this ladder of causation that was developed by Professor Judea Pearl. He's a computer scientist here at UCLA, a Turing Award winner, and he developed this idea of the ladder of causation. And the general idea, so it's meant to communicate a few things. One is, as you go up the ladder, you're sort of going more towards, you're moving from associative to causal relationships. That's the first thing. The other thing is, as you move up the ladder, you're moving to systems that have the ability to think and reason like humans do, right? So for example, at the top of the ladder, they're counterfactuals, right? As humans, we have the ability to imagine, to retrospect, to ask what if questions. Well, at this point, robots can't do that, right? And there's an argument that if you want robots to have human level intelligence, then part of the solution lies in this area of causal inference, right? So as I mentioned before, at the bottom of the ladder are associative activities. So that's, I would say, all of the data-driven work that we've been doing so far is sort of at this level, including machine learning, right? So we're getting associative answers, so we can ask questions where the associative relationships that we get are sufficient. The other level is at the level of intervention. So this is where you ask what if questions. What if I intervened in a particular way? How would that change my observation? And at the top is the level of imagining and retrospection. So this is where you start talking about counterfactuals and things like that. And so my argument is that in terms of the earthquake engineering tools that we have at our disposal, we can get associative relationships out of all three of these things, right? I would argue that at the intervention level, we can get that from simulation models and physical experiments. We cannot get it from statistical analysis of observational data. And you can throw machine learning in there as well, right? So yes, we can do simulations and physical experiments, but it's often the case that we want to use observed data as sort of the driving force behind the models we're developing. And I'm saying that if we're just using statistics or traditional machine learning, you're not going to be able to answer these interventional questions, at least not in a robust way. The same thing applies to the counterfactual questions, right? And so I'm also saying that there's this broad field of causal inference on observational data that's sort of been building over the years that I think it's important that we start leveraging. So I want to leave time for questions. So I'm going to try to wrap this up within the next 5 minutes, and we'll have at least 5 minutes for questions, but I'll be able to stay beyond one if we need more than 5 minutes for questions. This slide is basically trying to make the point that, you can't really extract causal information from these types of experimental data using just statistics. You might think you can, and there's a reason for that. We'll talk about that, but the fact of the matter is you can't. Same thing with field reconnaissance data. Traditional statistical models by themselves cannot be used to infer cause and effect. The investigative findings on field reconnaissance, if you go look back, they tend to be anecdotal rather than correlation-based. This is a picture, this is sort of a famous picture a famous image that is used by Janelle Maffei, the CEA director. Usually the buildings are side by side because they're actually neighboring buildings. right? So these are buildings, they were both subjected to the 2014 South Napa earthquake. One was retrofitted for cripple wall damage, one was not. And the argument was, well, they saw pretty much the same shaking intensity, and the retrofitted one performed well, the unretrofitted one didn't. And so therefore the cripple wall retrofit works. Now, we know the cripple wall retrofit works, but the extent to which it was the retrofit that actually is the thing that distinguished between the two types of damage. You know, this image is at best anecdotal information. It's not systematic information. This is another example that involves the South Napa earthquake, and there was an argument, or there was the question of whether or not basin effects was responsible for the damage. There was an investigation, but they found that, well, there are other things that could have caused the damage, like the age of the building and so forth. So at the end of the day, they came out with like correlation-based information. There are similar types of limitations for numerical simulation. So I mentioned simulation is interesting because in some cases we can mimic control interventions, but if we're trying to quantify the effect of specific ground motion properties, then we cannot we cannot conduct well-controlled experiments because we don't have complete control over the characteristics of the ground motions, assuming that we're using recorded ground motions, right? So we're relying on statistical analyses and correlations and so forth. And again, to reiterate the argument that these statistical techniques by themselves cannot give quantifiable causal insights. The same applies to response measurement data, right? I'm going to skip the next few slides. The point I was trying to make here is that we have a unique relationship to sort of the sort of causal versus associative thing, because in a lot of cases we quantify things based on associative relationships, but we know that there's a causal relationship, right? We can say that, yes, there is a causal relation, but we're not necessarily quantifying it. And I'm saying that we can do better than that. This last slide was meant to sort of start to introduce the anatomy of a causal inference problem, to start getting you familiar with some of the terminology and how you would think about the problem. This is actually my last slide. So this is all laid out in the paper, and given that I'm not going to go any further than this with any actual causal inference information, I think it's okay that I don't go into details about this, but I'm happy to answer questions later. So final thoughts. You often hear machine learning is just a tool, but it is just a tool, yes, but it can be very powerful. And so it's important that you use it in the right context. For us, it shouldn't be about the algorithms themselves, right? So wanting to do machine learning for the sake of just using machine learning, I think the time for that is past. We've done a lot of that within the past 10 years. So I think you want to sort of think carefully about the problem that you're trying to solve and what purpose is machine learning serving. I already touched on the issue that all the machine learning models we are using are based on allow us to get associational, not causal relationships. And we need to move beyond just exploration to real problem solving. Lastly, I'm advocating for a paradigm shift where we start using the language tools and models that have been developed in the field of causal inference. The reasons are, I think it would bring much needed clarity and transparency to our data-driven investigations. It will open the door to new questions. I think causal investigations are much more amenable to discovery relative to associational ones. And I think we will be able, so there is a way to use machine learning models in a causal context. But that's just not something that we've been able to leverage so far. So I think there's a big opportunity there. Professor Pearl here at UCLA talks about the fact that there's a causal revolution coming, and it is coming, right? So when I say it's sort of the next evolution in the way that we use data, it's something that's coming, and I think there's a lot of open questions in that regard that I think make for that are ripe for research. And with that, I will take any questions that you have. So I don't know, Omar, do you want to, how are you planning to manage the Q&A?
Yes. Yeah, I just unmuted myself. I was just saying that it's incredible that I've learned this much in 1 hour about kind of the whole landscape and the causal revolution. I think this is really timely, and I think a lot of people on the call right now are dealing with many problems in this space. So I really appreciate the way you kind of took the time to break everything down. And there was like a little nugget I felt for everyone to take apart from this. We have a few questions that are coming in. I'm thinking that if anyone on the call has a question, maybe just type Q in the chat, and then we will just call on you to ask your question. We have one from Arca to kick us off. Arca, you can request to unmute, and then Brian will unmute you.
It's just for everyone to unmute.
Okay, yeah. Arca, are you there?
Oh, yeah. So the question was like when we talked about the hybrid models. So I saw like it can be hybrid between like data-driven and the mechanics-based model. So what is the goal of like using that type of model? Like, is it like to address like some of the simplifications that we make when we use the mechanics-based model, or is it like more for the problems when we cannot really accurately implement the mechanics just for the fact that we do not have enough understanding on the phenomena that is going on?
Yeah, so this particular context was predicting the story drift response in steel moment frames. And before sort of, let's call it the machine learning era, there was a lot of models developed to do that using like, equivalent SDOF. Some of them said you can do an elastic analysis of the MDOF. And then there's these techniques to sort of get you from elastic to inelastic. And so what we found is that if you do a purely data-driven model, meaning you just build nonlinear models, do the analyses, get data, train it, and look at the performance. If you use a hybrid model, meaning within your features, you actually use some information that you can get out of, say, linear elastic MDOF model, right? Which is something that's often used in the context of design anyway. That can actually improve the performance of the model in terms of predictive performance.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
So in that context, can we say like incremental dynamic analysis is kind of a hybrid model, because we have like nonlinear analysis, but we like do like incremental dynamic analysis?
Well, so yeah, you can argue that, but it's not hybrid in the way that I've been describing. It's hybrid in the sense that it involves both physics and statistics, but that's pretty much any simulation model you're using that has stochasticity. You're going to be, doing some type of statistical analysis on that. So that's so you can call it hybrid in that sense, but that's not really the way that I was using the word. I was using it in the sense that, as opposed to like it's hybrid in the sense that it's more like from the end of the user, they actually have to do some things with a physics-based model in order to get information to put into the machine learning model.
I see.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good question.
Other questions from the audience? While you guys are thinking, I selfishly have a question. Professor, you mentioned on the section about active learning that there was really this key point of being able to identify what the threshold is for the purposes of ending the training.
Yes.
Would one example of like that identification be like to assess the relative importance of the variables, say, in the model, and to check whether or not the importance matches our understanding? Or is it some other way that you would go about picking out that threshold in your experience?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So the point you made, I didn't think about it. I mean, I is not something that I thought about before. So I think that could be one way to involve to sort of inform a sort of generalized understanding of that stopping criteria. And by generalize, I mean we say as a community we have enough confidence to say if you're using this type of system, you know, you can use you can use this particular threshold as the stopping criteria, and you're pretty confident that you don't have to run the entire event set. Now, one way you can do that is you can just have enough experience doing this, running through the entire event set, where you have enough information that you can sort of make that, draw that conclusion. But Omar, I like what you said, because that, you know, to also inform that, you can actually look at the relationships between the variables that are driving the performance, and you can say, okay, within the events that are left, what are the characteristics of those variables? And that might tell me something about whether or not I need to go back into that event set and keep sampling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I face that as you know, a lot in my own work. So and
Yep.
there's like a bunch of data that we're training on. It's great to know when to stop.
Yeah.
Especially when you're using like random sampling. Yeah, that's very interesting. I haven't actually dabbled a lot with active learning, so this is very useful.
Yep.
Does anyone else have a question related to the causal inference piece of the presentation? I know that's probably
I can be here until 1:15. So who, you
okay.
know, people who are okay with being on the call, I'm here. Other questions?
Yeah, so I have a question. Is that
Yeah.
Oh yeah. So when you were comparing, let's say, some analytical equations versus just the visualizations, is that something that you'll see, for example, happening in the codes maybe in the future? Like how can codes actually take that and adapt that to the current guidelines and so on?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I would like to think that at some point, now, you know, there are sort of analytical equations that we have a lot of confidence in, right? That are sort of purely physics based. But when it comes to sort of analytical empirical equations, I would like to think that we will get to a point eventually where we can do away with those, right? And if someone, and if I can put my mind into someone who in the mind of someone who doesn't agree with that, they might say, well, the main point they would make is that, you know, these analytical equations allow us to build that intuition. Well, I think if we have enough time where we're using these sort of visual representations of explanation that come out of a machine learning model, I think over time, as a community, we'll start being able to build that intuition, such that once we sort of are able to see plots of, you know, they might be three-dimensional, they might be surfaces, they, you know, we'll be able to sort of have that intuition, you know, just as quickly as we can for the analytical models. So the way how you put that together in the form of a building code, I haven't really thought that far ahead yet, but yeah, you'd certainly need to have some of those visual representations included in some type of document.
Amazing. Someone just sent me another question related to the schema of the database.
Yes.
I think it's essentially, I think it's fascinating that this is work that's being done, because I think, like, when we think about trying to understand the behavior of systems within the context of recovery, like it's very difficult to find data like that. Mm-hmm. And so has the schema been used to has it been deployed essentially to collect any data from, say, earthquakes that have happened recently, or not yet?
Well, so the schema, so when you use the word schema, that's just sort of the way the data is organized in the relational database. Now, so the databases that we showed, one of them is already out there on Design Safe. and there's a Spectra paper on it. And the other one is going through the review process in Spectra. And so once we're done with that review process, it will be out there. But this one actually is out there. Right now it only has data from the 2014 South Napa earthquake. But the idea behind this schema is that once there's sort of an agreement on how the data should be organized, it should be relatively easy to add other events to it.
That's really cool. And I guess my follow-up question on that is, like, within the context of recovery, have you seen data being collected for either lifelines or buildings in that context? I know there's a lot of conversation about MIRI and some of these other reconnaissance teams going out and collecting that data, but I would imagine it's very difficult to collect, right? Like,
yes.
So is there like any efforts being done to kind of work in conjunction with the database structure? That structure is kind of a way to organize reconnaissance teams to go and collect data that fits that format, if that makes sense? Or is there any unified efforts?
That makes complete sense. So the short answer is no. And I think part of the reason why it's no is because, you know, this particular database and paper was us trying to say, for this type of data, we think this is a good way to organize it. And we have an event that we sort of use to demonstrate that. But I think if you want to build one that's sort of generalized across events and systems, I think you need a much more collaborative effort. You know, as much as I have confidence in sort of the way we organize things, for these things, it's always best when, especially for something like this, where if you're going to say, you know, you're going to ask a lot of different groups to collect data and curate data based on this, I think you need more eyes on the creation of the schema and the database itself. So I think for us, this was more like a starting point to say, look, there's a way to organize this data that is easy to use. There's a way to structure it. So you know, I think at some point we need to come together as a community and let's agree on the structure, put it out there, and that way people can you know.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Awesome. Does anyone else in the audience have one last question? Going once, going twice. Okay. Professor, I really appreciate. Oh, Andrew? Oh, am I muted? No, I'm not muted.
Andrew trying to ask a question, but he's muted.
Oh, Andrew,
Thank you.
Okay.
Oh,
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah. Okay, great.
Okay, cool. Sorry about that. I had a question on the hybrid modeling. That's actually
Yeah.
really similar to a project I'm working on right now.
Mhm.
So you were kind of doing more of like a ML on top, trying to improve accuracy as kind of like an additional filter stage to kind of calibrate the results, right? But that requires a lot of work, having to set up the physics-based model and the theoretical model and then run it through and all that stuff.
Yes.
But your effort was mostly primarily focused on improving accuracy. But if you wanted to improve computational time as a parameter for like real-time damage assessment, that kind of a thing, is there anything that you would change to approach it from that kind of a framework?
Well, so there's a couple of different things here. So there's the effort involved in building up the predictive model, right? But once the predictive model is deployed, then, for example, if it's deployed in real time, then there isn't really that level of effort that's required. Yeah, so I don't know, does that answer your question, or were you thinking something else?
So I guess I was just wondering if you ran the model every time as you fed it into the machine. Like you ran the physics-based simulation in OpenSeas, right?
Yes.
If you ran that every time you called the machine learning function, or if you ran it like once and then it was done.
No. So we basically said, so the way it would work is we define sort of an archetype space, if you will, that says this model is going to be
Your time, Professor. I will, before we go, I would like to congratulate our 10 lucky winners. So, Professor, as you know, there was a draw today, and we had 100 RSVPs. 10% got access to the Uber Eats voucher. This is evidence that these vouchers were distributed. Just wanted to congratulate them. Next time, please do sign up to attend our next event, because we will be doing this every single time, and hopefully at higher proportions, as a linear function of time. But in any case, thank you so much, Professor, for sharing your insight and wisdom on this first event of the year. We hope that you stay in touch with the peer student committee, and hopefully we have a second follow-up chat on all of this stuff. I think there's a lot of amazing nuggets in there, and if you share the slides, I'll send them out to all of the participants.
Yep, happy to do that. All right, thanks again.
Thank you so much, guys. Have a great day.